Level 1. The Backyard Theorist. You're 17 years old, and your bedroom looks less like a teenager's room and more like a physics department nobody approved. Corkboard covered in printed diagrams of Minkowski spacetime. A whiteboard your parents let you keep on the condition you erase it before family visits comes over. You bought it secondhand for €40 because a real one costs $300. You're not building anything yet. You're reading. Special relativity first because it's the door everyone has to walk through, then general relativity, which makes special relativity look like arithmetic. You don't understand tensor calculus. Nobody your age does. You watch lecture recordings from universities you'll never attend, pausing every 20 seconds to rewrite an equation you don't fully believe. Your first real project isn't a time machine. It's a cesium-free atomic clock experiment using off-the-shelf components and an oscillator you calibrated by hand for 3 weeks. It's accurate to 1 second every 4 years. That's not good enough for anything serious, but it's the first time you've measured time instead of just assumed it. You strap one clock to a drone and leave one on the ground. You fly the drone in a tight circle for 2 hours at 40 meters altitude. The difference in elapsed time between the two clocks is smaller than your equipment can even detect. You expected that. You needed to see it fail before you understood why it would take a satellite, not a drone, to show relativistic time dilation at a scale you could measure. Every failed experiment teaches you the difference between knowing an equation and understanding what it costs to test it. This is how it starts for everyone who ever touched the edge of this field. Not with a machine, with a whiteboard, a secondhand clock, and a stubborn refusal to accept that time is simple. Level 2. The Physics Undergraduate. You're 19, and you're in your first real classroom for this, an introductory relativity course that most students take as an elective and you take as a reason to exist. The professor writes the Lorentz transformation on the board like it's routine. To you, it's the equation you've been circling for 2 years finally being handed to you properly. You learn there's a difference between time dilation from velocity and time dilation from gravity, and that GPS satellites correct for both every single day just to keep working. You learn the number that changes your life a little. Without relativistic correction, GPS would drift by about 10 kilometers per day. The whole system runs on equations you're only now learning to use correctly. You join a research group in your second year, not because they need you, because you emailed the professor 11 times. Your first real task is unglamorous: data cleaning from a muon detector experiment measuring particle decay at different altitudes, a direct physical proof of time dilation happening in the atmosphere above your head every second. You spend 200 hours in a basement lab logging numbers into a spreadsheet. It's not what you imagined. It's also the first time you've touched real evidence instead of a textbook diagram. You fail your first exam on general relativity, not because you didn't study, because the math finally caught up to the ambition. You retake the course. You pass the second time with a mark you're not proud of, but an understanding you are. Grades measure performance on a day. Understanding compounds, regardless of the grade. Level 3. The Graduate Researcher. You're 23 and you've been accepted into a doctoral program studying closed timelike curves in general relativity, a subject your relatives still can't correctly explain at dinner. Your advisor is blunt about what this field actually is. Nobody has built a time machine. Nobody is close. What exists is mathematics that doesn't forbid certain solutions, and a small, serious community trying to understand whether those solutions mean anything physical or whether they're just equations that happen not to break. You spend your first year on the Gödel metric, a solution to Einstein's field equations from 1949 that technically permits closed timelike curves in a rotating universe. It's not our universe, it's a mathematically valid one. That distinction is the entire discipline in one sentence. You run simulations. You crash your university's shared computing cluster twice trying to model exotic matter distributions with negative energy density, a requirement for keeping a theoretical wormhole open that nobody has ever observed in nature.
Your supervisor doesn't get angry. He tells you that crashing the cluster means you were finally asking a big enough question. Your first published paper is a footnote in the field, a refinement of boundary conditions on a traversable wormhole model originally proposed in 1988. It gets cited 4 times in its first year. That's a real number in a field this small. You defend your thesis at 27. 3 professors ask you questions for 2 hours. One of them, a name you've read in textbooks, told you your chapter on energy condition violations was the most rigorous he's seen from a doctoral candidate in a decade. You don't sleep that night, not from stress, from the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being taken seriously for the first time. Level 4. The Postdoctoral Physicist. You're 29 and you've moved to a research institute that studies quantum gravity, the unsolved problem sitting underneath everything you've worked on, because general relativity and quantum mechanics don't currently agree with each other, and any real theory of time travel would need both. You're not building a machine, you're building models, closed timelike curves interacting with quantum information, a subfield barely 20 years old, built on a 1991 proposal by physicist David Deutsch describing how quantum bits might behave near a closed timelike curve without producing the grandfather paradox, resolving it instead through self-consistent quantum states. You spend 14 months on one calculation. You collaborate with a quantum computing lab that lets you run a small experimental approximation of Deutsch's model using 4 qubits, not actual time travel, a simulation of the mathematics using entangled particles. The experiment behaves the way the model predicts. That's not proof time travel is possible, it's proof the equations are internally consistent in a lab, which is the only kind of proof this field can currently offer. You publish the result. It gets picked up by 3 science journalists who oversimplify it into headlines about time machines that make your colleagues wince and your parents finally understand what you do for a living. Incorrectly, but understand something. You start receiving invitations to conferences. You start receiving emails from cranks with perpetual motion diagrams and conspiracy theories about the government suppressing time travel. You learn to answer them politely and never argue about actual physics with someone who doesn't know what a metric tensor is. Level 5. The Recognized Researcher. You're 33 and people in this small field know your name before you introduce yourself. Not famous, known. The way a good specialist is known inside a field nobody outside it thinks about. You've published 19 papers. 3 of them are cited regularly by other researchers building on your models of quantum information near closed timelike curves. You get invited to review other people's papers before publication, which means you're now one of the people deciding what counts as rigorous enough to enter the field's permanent record. You mentor your first graduate student, watching her make the exact same mistakes you made, crashing a computing cluster with an overambitious exotic matter simulation, and you recognize the specific kind of exhaustion on her face after her first real result. You start a side project modeling the energy requirements for a traversable wormhole at laboratory scale instead of cosmological scale, using a 2017 proposal that suggested quantum entanglement itself might be mathematically equivalent to a wormhole, an idea called ER equals EPR, connecting Einstein and Rosen's 1935 wormhole paper to Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen's entanglement paper from the same year, 2 papers by the same people that nobody connected for 80 years. You spend 4 months proving a small extension of that idea wrong, which in this field counts as a genuine contribution, because ruling out a wrong path is how the field narrows toward a right one. You get invited to give a talk at a major physics conference, 400 people in the audience. You're not there because you found a time machine, you're there because you found a mistake in someone else's equation that mattered.
Level 7. The Principal Investigator. You're 38 and you run your own lab now. 4 graduate students, 2 postdocs, a 5-year grant worth $2.8 million from a national science foundation that reviewed your proposal against 11 competing teams and chose yours. Your research question is no longer whether closed timelike curves are mathematically possible. That was settled decades before you were born. Your question is whether any physical process in this universe, not a hypothetical one, could ever produce the exotic conditions the mathematics requires. The honest current answer, the one you give at every conference, is that nothing observed in this universe has come close, and the amount of negative energy required exceeds anything physics currently knows how to produce, by a margin so large that some of your own students ask you privately whether the whole field is chasing something permanently impossible. You tell them the same thing your advisor told you. Physics has been wrong about permanently impossible before, and physics has also been right about it. The only way to know which one this is to keep doing the work rigorously enough that the answer, whatever it is, means something. You published the most cited paper of your career, refining the energy bounds required for a traversable wormhole using updated quantum field theory, lowering the theoretical requirement by an order of magnitude from earlier estimates. It's still far beyond anything achievable. It's progress measured in decimal places, and in this field, decimal places are the unit of hope. Level 7, the department chair. You're 44, and you run an entire theoretical physics department now. 30 faculty members, a budget in the tens of millions, decisions about which research directions get funded and which get quietly allowed to end. You still do research, less of it, protected carefully in the mornings before administrative work takes the rest of the day. You testify before a national science committee about quantum gravity research funding, explaining to politicians who have 60 seconds of attention for the topic why fundamental physics with no immediate application deserves public money. You use the GPS example every time, because it's the one piece of relativity everyone already depends on without knowing it, a discovery that took 40 years between Einstein's equations and a single practical use. And that gap is the argument you make for research nobody can yet justify. You lose one funding fight and win two. You mentor department chairs at other universities now, the way you were mentored. A journalist asks you directly, on camera, if time travel will ever be possible. You give the answer you've given for 15 years, that the mathematics doesn't forbid it, that nature so far hasn't provided the conditions, and that the honest answer is you don't know, and anyone in your field who claims certainty in either direction isn't doing the work carefully enough. Level 8, the paradigm builder. You're 51, and your name is now attached to a specific theoretical framework, cited in textbooks as a refinement that changed how the field calculates energy conditions near closed timelike curves. A model your lab built decades earlier gets an unexpected application, not in time travel research, in the study of black hole information, a completely different problem that turned out to share mathematics with the question you spent your whole career on. That's the part nobody explains to you at the beginning. The work you do chasing one impossible question sometimes answers a different question nobody asked you to solve. You're invited to a summit of theoretical physicists discussing the black hole information paradox, and the room includes names you read as a 17-year-old on your corkboard. You present for 40 minutes. Afterward, one of them, a physicist whose papers you photocopied in an undergraduate library 20 years ago, asks you a question about your own model that you don't immediately know how to answer. You spend that night in your hotel room working through it on hotel stationery, the same way you worked through equations on a secondhand whiteboard at 17. Some things about doing this work never change, only the stakes and the company. Level 9, the legacy. You're 60, and you've spent your career on a question that may never be answered in your lifetime, may never be answered in anyone's lifetime, and may, decades or centuries from now, turn out to matter in a way none of you currently understand. The way relativity itself sat as pure mathematics for years before anyone found a practical use for it. You've trained 14 doctoral students who now hold positions at institutions across 3 continents. 2 of them are working on problems you couldn't have posed when you started, using mathematics that didn't exist when you were their age. You give your final lecture before stepping back from the department. You tell the room the truth you've come to believe after 40 decades. This field will likely not produce a time machine in your lifetime, or in the lifetime of anyone currently studying it. That was never really the point. The point was always whether the universe permits certain things or forbids them, and answering that honestly, rigorously over a lifetime is a kind of achievement that doesn't need a machine to justify it. You still keep a whiteboard in your office, the way you kept one in your childhood bedroom. Some evenings you still work through an old problem for the pleasure of it, not because anyone asked you to. And somewhere right now, a 17-year-old is standing in front of a secondhand whiteboard their parents let them keep on one condition, staring at an equation from a textbook they don't fully believe yet, about to spend 3 weeks calibrating a clock accurate to 1 second every 4 years, about to fail an experiment that was never going to work, and about to understand for the first time the difference between knowing an equation and testing what it costs. They'll figure it out. Most do. A few of them will spend a lifetime on a question that isn't answered yet. That's how it's supposed to work.